Well, thank you, Mia, for the wonderful introduction, and thank you all for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. So before I start, I just would like to acknowledge my co-authors, Yifan Shen, he now at HKUST, and also Susan Short, my colleague at Brown. So looking to the kind of a work in it, so give you a little bit background, thinking about division of labor after marriage. I think, from history, the theory, there's always this favors men as breadwinners and a woman sort of as homemakers. And this type of division of labor, in a way, is sort of maximizes household well-being among different gender married couples. So there has been a lot of work in the past, and typically more fitting to sort of the traditional norm that men specialize in paid work and a woman in home production. I think things sort of changed over the last, 20, 30 years. There's a rapid improvement in women's education. And that education then, it really brings into different types of marriages that sort of challenge the traditional norm of this sort of a specialization. I think the late Sarah McLaren, talk about this, talk about those divergent destinies, right? Talking about how educational attainment of women could really change the kind of families that we live in. So the one point is, they argue is that college-educated women have higher earnings than their less educated counterparts. And also husbands of college-educated women are more involved in household tasks and child rearing. So when we talk about gender revolution, a stored revolution at a home, it seems to suggest that college-educated women and their partners are going to sort of break that kind of the barrier, and there's more sort of revisiting the traditional gender division of labor. But when we look at some of the past research, and typically we see the research only focus on educational attainment of one gender, right? Typically from a women's perspective or men's perspective. And there's not as much thinking about, partners' educational attainment. For example, when a college-educated woman marries, then she could marry a college-educated man, and versus she could also marry a non-college educated man. So would that really give us the same story in terms of the division of labor and how they spend time in the workplace and maybe at the same time at home. So this is sort of the motivation for our research or thinking educational assorted mating, has very strong implications for social inequality. You look at type of marriage, it really more or less determines the kind of inequality at home, so that how really do men and women of different educational pairing fare in earnings when they have one or more children. So they say when you have children, how do they make decisions, right? So especially, and this is a type of things, it will be interesting to look into the impact. So and I think a lot of you, are very familiar with that type of literature talking about marriage premium, mostly, for men. Typically, men with higher earnings are more likely to marry. So that's sort of a selection into this marriage. And they are, and also, when they have higher earnings at the beginning, it's much easier for their earnings to grow more rapidly. So, so married men typically have higher earnings, and their earnings will continue over time. And also marriage itself, sort of makes men, more productive for specializing in non-household production. This is something, especially when children are involved. So this type of relationship, and then also, not only just from the home perspective, but also from employment perspective, employer favors sort of those married men, and thinking they are more tied into this sort of the context of organizational hegemonic masculinity, to think about, they are the ones who can really contribute to the employment. They are more stable. They are more likely to keep, the workplace, in sort of an ideal workplace. But at the same time, there's also argument for this job tenure, and typically married men are likely to stay in a job for a longer period of time, and there's more opportunity for promotions. And at the same time, when they move to other jobs, they're more likely to move sort of an upward trajectory in terms of mobility. So there's a lot of argument for this marriage premium for married men in that type of relationship. At the same time, there is also this marriage penalty for women, right? Typically, married women, earn significantly less than unmarried women, and typically they make less earnings. And also, marriage also makes women more likely to specialize in household production. And at the same time, there's this employer discrimination. The other way, you do not trust, in a sense, in terms of work and the kind of positions or promotions, they could more likely to skip, married women because of those sort of a potential, discrimination thinking, how they could be different compared to married men. And as a result, because of marriage or maybe childbearing, and there's also women are more likely to, do temporary and part-time jobs, which also really makes it more difficult for them to move up, in terms of earnings and a job mobility. And I think things could get even more so is with this parenthood, with having children. I think it's really what to do with children. Obviously, having children increase the amount of time in household labor, and there's this kind of specialization will only increase with more children. Right? Children, having more children is going to really penalize the sort of women, and the women will need to whether they want to spend more time at home raising or caring for children, and then also there's this sort of a larger fatherhood premium for married than for unmarried fathers. And then fathers at the same time having children sort of motivate them to really to increase more, spend more time, investing more time in the workplace. So that's sort of the things, employer at the same time, also use, parenthood status as a proxy for worker productivity, with fathers versus mothers, there's a sort of different expectations in terms of then what it is the right place for them to work. So with having children for women, and also there's this work interruptions, which also can be long-term negative effects on the women's wages. So we are all kind of familiar with that type of literature, with the marriage premium for men and marriage penalty for women, and certainly partnered parenthood would really exacerbate the type of divisions. So I want to just bring in the type of educational assorted mating. Obviously, a lot of research work on in this area focus on one gender. They look at a woman's perspective or man's perspective. But obviously, in a relationship, in a joint, in a families, it is really man, husband, wife's life, linked. They, make decisions about, how they want to spend time. Whether the husband spends more time at work, and whether wife, spends more time at home. But at the same time, given the rapid increase in women's educational attainment, I think there's often there's a revisit of what does that mean, right? Especially in a situation when the wife has more education than the husband, maybe potentially the wife has more potentials at workplace, despite some of the discrimination that we're seeing against married women. So this is sort of the question that we try to see in this research. The specialization theory has often been tested in sort of from the single gender models, and we try to bring sort of couples in to compare their earnings sort of trajectories. So in this perspective, we more emphasize sort of the heterogeneity in the fatherhood premium and also in a motherhood penalty. And so by educational sort of mating, we're more asking, if the woman has college education, if she is married to a man with a college education, how does that affect those, fatherhood premium and motherhood penalty? But at the same time, if the woman, a college educated woman marries a non-college educated man, that how does that affect it? Which this is going to be, I think, a growing issue, phenomenon as we look at hypogamous marriage has been increasing pretty rapidly. I think the recent data shows like 22% of the marriages involving women with more education than a husband, right? So this is sort of the issue that, obviously you look at recent data, there are far more college graduates than who are women than men. So that's only going to increase in the future. So there's an understanding of this hypogamous marriage, which will be, meaningful for us to understand. So the sort of the inequality that we're seeing in the workplace and also at home. But thinking about hypergamy, homogamy, and hypogamy, right? So it's a little mouthful, but hypergamy is the husband has more education than a wife. Homogamy, same levels of education, and hypogamy, that the woman has more education. Thinking about, obviously people are selecting into those type of unions. So there's a preference and there's an opportunity. So it's, it is unclear as to whether people just favors, homogamy. I think that, like marries like, people tend to want to marry someone who are just like themselves. But whether that's, issue, in educational homogamy, whether that's an issue that we don't have 100% of the data, whether there's people who favors hypogamy or hypergamy. So at least the way of thinking, it is really the process of preference and opportunity. Depends on, who are available, how they look for partners. We could get into those different type of relationships, and then we are interested in how each of this relationship will affects their sort of earning trajectories after marriage. So education, when we think about hypergamous marriage, for example, that's fitting to our traditional definition of division of labor, right? Hypergamous marriage is the husband has more education than the wife. And then, so that typically means, parenthood leads to higher premium for husband and a higher penalty for wife. So typically wife, after they have children, they're more likely to stay home and caring for the children. At the same time, the husband will spend more time at work and just, investing more in the workplace. This is sort of a hypergamous marriage fitting into sort of the traditional norm that we have. And just also reflective of the fact that in the past, there were more marriages that are hypergamous, and it is fitting into sort of the traditional norm. But at the same time, we are also seeing a lot more marriages that are homogamous, right? That, I think especially when women's education improved to a point that there are more marriages that, men and women have same levels of education. So especially for men and women, both with high college education, what does that really tell us? In the college educated, couples, typically, will have husband continuing in sort of a workplace and have higher, marriage premium. But I think at the same time provides flexibility to the wife. One is the wife could, certainly they have resources maybe to hire people for domestic services and childcare, and so allow the wife to pursue job careers. But at the same time, they could also have a choice for the wife to stay home and care for children or raising children and families. So in a sense, homogamous marriage, builds this flexibility, and that's sort of what we are seeing is that there's I think the wife has a choice of, in a lot of ways to look for the different possibilities. hypogamous marriage is little different, right? Hypogamous marriage is, one question is, people talk about, women in hypogamous marriage could challenge the traditional sort of a male dominant status in marriage. So they're more thinking, so in that particular case, the woman in hypogamous marriage could maybe seek, marriage premium. They will be spending more time in the workplace, and instead maybe having a husband and doing more in the home front, right? Just like, you switch the gender roles, but it is possible that the women will spend more time because they have the higher education, potentially have higher occupation and higher earnings. And but at the same time, maybe men in this type of relationship, will have this penalty, so they could, in theory, spend more time at the home front. But in reality, it is also possible that women in these type of relationship have to juggle, right? The juggle is, when it's not, it's difficult to just to remove the sort of a whole household production, and they need to sort of thinking how much they can sacrifice, by doing or relying on the husband to do most of the housework or the child caring. But so this is sort of a juggling act, mostly for women in that type of relationship, especially we are thinking there could be, educational differences in earnings and in job choices, what would a husband do, in that type of situation, more time at work or more time at home, and how would that affect the women's relationship. So type of hypothesis we are developing is looking into among couples in hypergamous marriage. Specialization is likely to be the strongest, right? Fitting to this, traditional norm. College-educated husbands are likely to receive more fatherhood premium, and non-college educated wives are likely to receive more motherhood penalty compared to couples in homogamous or hypogamous marriages. So this is sort of fitting to what we know with men have high education, women with lower education, sort of then it's easier to fall into this traditional gender division of labor. Then among college-educated couples in homogamous marriage, both of them have college education. So motherhood penalty is likely to be in the middle, just because of the flexibility that we talk about. And there could be, women could choose to maybe spend more time at workplace with the support of the resources in child caring and domestic services. But at the same time, and they could choose just to stay home and caring for the children if that's if it's needed. And then among couples in hypogamous marriage, then both motherhood penalty and the fatherhood premium may be lower. One is, the women with high education, and they try to stay in the workplace, right? But at the same time, there's needs for caring for the children and housework. So the penalty will be lower in that case. But at the same time, fatherhood premium may be also lower because of their potentially skill sets, or maybe those are the because they have no college education. So those are kind of the differences that we're seeing potentially for these three different types of pairings. So the data that we are using is the National Longitudinal Study of Youth aged 14 to 22 in 79, and they were collected annually from 1979 to 1993, but then biannually from 1994 on. So there's a good retention rate of 71%. And so we use the data pretty much up to the 2018 wave. And then we look at couples who first married between this period, between 1979 and 2018. And then we really follow them for 10 years and see, how many had children, whether children affects their earnings. So this is, for obviously for those who divorced, they were censored at the time of divorce, and also we not able to, just follow those who get lost to the follow-up. So we had a total sample about 5,478 couples to work with. And so pretty much we follow them over time, and then see how many of them, got married and what happened, then their earning trajectories, after the marriage, and see how children would play a role in their earning patterns. So variables that we study, I think, we talk about this, one is homogamous marriage, both have college degrees. And then we also both have some college and both high school or less. That's sort of homogamous marriage. And then we also look at hypogamous marriage, two types. One is wife is college educated, husband is not. And also we have wife has no college, but has more education than the husband. So there could be the other. And as hypergamous is husband is college educated and wife is not. And then also the other type is husband has no college, but more education than wife. So these are all types, but for this presentation, I will focus on the ones with the bullet point. So more like looking at couples in which at least one has college education. So more looking into college versus other type of relationships. Control variables, like family background and also race, ethnicity, age of marriage for husbands and wives. Obviously, when you get married, it has a lot to do with your initial earnings, and those with high college degrees are much more likely to marry at later ages compared to other groups. So these are sort of the controls that we have in the model. We use dependent variable. We're more looking into earnings after marriage. We follow them for 10 years. And then we use this annual earnings, we adjusted to $2019 and to take into account of, hours work and employment, whether they're part-time or full-time. So we only use earnings as sort of annual level to just get a good sense of their earning potentials rather than trying to differentiate whether they work part-time or full-time. But obviously, when there is a child caring needs or household work, there's a much more likely that people will switch to part-time work if they have to spend time, but it got reflected in the earnings. So we'll use earnings as a important dependent variables. So we look at wives and husbands' earnings over time. And we also look at share of wives' earning to the couple's earning. So they're looking into how that share changes when they have children, or when they, when we look at the time, after marriage. We do fixed effects models. It's controlling number of children. See how, whether you have one child, whether you have two or more children, influences, compared to those without children, right? And we also use years since first marriage as a dummies as a control. Then make sure that each couple must contribute at least 2 years to the model for the fixed effects to work. And we use the fixed effects to really net out the confounding unmeasured factors and things like somebody, if it's ability or talent or whatever, somebody is more likely to have a good job and maybe also more likely to get married. So those are kind of unobserved factors will be taken into account in fixed effects models. We also look into control for standard errors and at the individual level. Interest here is more thinking about how educational pairing affects the earning trajectory. So we introduce the interactions between educational pairing and number of children, because educational pairing is a constant. You certainly will get dropped out if we just keep it in the model, but we will use the interactions for sort of understanding how pairing interacts with number of children, which is measured at a 0, 1, or 2 plus. We also include interactions between race and number of children to see how the race of the partner influences the kind of earning trajectories. So this is a descriptive tables and give you a sense of the three groups that we are talking about. It is homogamous marriage in the sort of first two rows, and that's limit to college or more. And then the middle column is a hypergamous marriage that college-educated husband and a wife has no college education, and also no completed college education. And the last one is a hypogamous marriage, and this is a college-educated wife and a husband has no college education. So the big story here, I mean, just not big story. The story here is there's selection going on too, right? If we look at, these are the variables that's very much measured in 1979, so background characteristics. And you can see mother's years of schooling, for example, among homogamous marriage, both husband and wife have college education. Mother's schooling is the highest, right? And then also look at family income. And also, again, they have the highest income. And also percent parents married at age 14, highest for this particular group. And then AFQT, the Air Force qualification test percentile, is also highest for this particular group. So what it means is for hypogamous marriage, both have college education. This is sort of more selective of those with high, more resources, when at the baseline. Right, so this is the type of homogamy actually attracts the sort of more at the baseline with high characteristics. They're also more likely to be white, to be homogamous marriages. And at the same time, we look at hypergamous and hypogamous marriages. They have lower family income, and also they're more likely to be minorities, and maybe parents are more likely not to be married when they were age 14. So this is sort of the things that we see. There are differences among these three groups. At the same time, we can also look at their earnings at time of marriage. Why at marriage, the marriage duration is 0. Again, we see the differences in earnings for the homogamous marriage, 41,000, 57,000 women and the men, but then it's lower here. But again, we are seeing for the wife in hypogamous marriages, it is 33,000 compared to husband 44,000. So even though they have high education, at least at the time of marriage, they have a lower earnings. So these are sort of the differences we see. There's sort of selection into these type of marriages. In homogamous marriage, are more likely to attract those with sort of with resources from their baseline data. Yeah.
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
How do you get a different end within marriages for husbands and wives if they're paired?
Yeah, they were paired, but there were occasionally they were missing data.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's potentially they are all in pairs, but for NLSY data, there's a female respondents and male respondents, but they also ask about their partners, and then sometimes partners information is not as complete, so we see some of the discrepancy in the pair.
I see, but we at least know the education, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to be in that.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
But why do you have AFQT for spouse? I thought that's only available for the main respondent.
Yeah. So this is more from the main respondents that we all have men and women. So only have the main. When if male have the respondents, we have the AFQT and women in the same way. So this is based on the main respondents.
So this is missing for half of the sample.
Only, yeah, I think only for this variable, but there, most of the variables, they have the information for both powers. So now we sort of getting a sense of their trajectories. Let's just take a look at women's earnings after marriage. So, one thing is education plays a role, right? And then you're looking to this one is both have college education, the highest earning trajectories. And then the green one is in hypogamous marriage. The wife has college education, husband does not have college education. And then you look into the other types. So this is what's really telling us is women's earnings do not increase much, right? They're sort of a stagnated, for the 10 years of marriage. There's really kind of flat for most of the groups. But there are differences by education attainment. And women in homogamous marriage have the highest earnings in the first 10 years of their life, in the first 10 years of their marriage. But then this one is a hypogamous marriage that the woman has college education and the husband does not. But it has a lower starting point, but sort of trying to catch up. And otherwise, we are seeing, the differences is the women's earnings do not increase, after marriage. In contrast, we're seeing men's earnings, after marriage. There seemed to be a much, stronger trajectory of growth, right, after marriage. So this is both college homogamous marriage, and the husband earnings really sort of took off. The longer you see, they're having a much higher, earnings, after, marriage from 0 to 10 years of marriage. And this is the group is hypergamous marriage. The husband has college education and the wife has no college education, but husband's earnings also increases, but sort of trails on the homogamous marriage. But we take a look at the green line. Green is wife has college, the husband has no college education. So this is the green line. It is, the husband's earnings, it's increasing, but it's a much slower pace. So obviously what we see here is that whether you have college education really matters, right? In this college education, you're seeing much sharp growth in earnings, but not so much for people in other groups. So I want to sort of really focus on the couples, at least one of which has college education. So this is the three groups of, that we are comparing. Top three men's earnings. This is homogamous marriage. Husband's earnings. It was the same graph from the last two, but we put the men and women together. For the couples, at least one has college education. So this is the red. That's for husband homogamy. Both have college education. This is husband hypogamous marriage. Husband's earnings, and then we are seeing also the green one. This is for hypogamous marriage, husband's earnings. So this is much lower compared to the top two. But then look at women. That's the three solid, the thicker lines. And this is homogamous marriage. You're seeing this kind of a relationship. It's higher than hypogamous marriage, than women's earnings. So if there's a, homogamous marriage, it has its advantage, even for women on, after the marriage. And this, the last line is for hypergamous marriage. Wife has no college education, so they were at the lowest. So you can see sort of the marriage penalty potentially that they are more likely to stay at the bottom. So obviously, this is just descriptive data. There's a lot. What's behind is, whether they have children, right? Whether they have children, that could play a role here. So, one thing, sort of again, descriptively, we'll get a sense of whether there's also selection into fertility. Whether men and women in hypogamous marriage, for example, have really the lowest from our sample, have the lowest number of children. That's the hypogamous marriage. Women have high education, college education, and the husband does not. They have the lowest number of children in comparison to homogamous marriage. both have college degrees, so they, reasonably they have higher fertility. So keep that in mind of the potential selection process. So then we, run fixed effects model. We try to look into how number of children, affects marriage penalty and also marriage premium. And then we first look at wife's earnings, for example. Wife's earning, if we don't look into other variables, only number of children and also other dummies that we control, because having one child for wives to reduce earning by about 48,000, right? 4,800. And for the 2 and more children, we reduce the earnings by 9,700. So that's for the wife's earning decline after they have children. But similarly, we look at husband's earnings. This is sort of an increase the marriage premium. We talk about having one child increase the husband's earning by 5,100, and then having 2 or more children increase the earning by 7,800. So these are sort of differences. Then we introduce interactions. We are trying to understand how having one child and type of sort of mating influences the results. So these are sort of the data here, but obviously it's very hard to read. So let me just show you a graph to look into this relationship. This one shows, one child, homogamy, both college degrees. So having one child for women, and that's sort of a decline in their earnings. Having one child for college-educated women in homogamous marriage. And this is sort of the gain for men. After having one child, how much gains in their earnings, they're almost like 20,000 gains here, less than 20,000, but that's the gain we see here. And then we see hypergamous marriage. Well, husband has college education, wife does not. And then again, we're seeing this, penalty is much larger, right, for the wife. When the wife has no college education, the husband has. And this is the gain for hypergamous marriage, college educated men. And what we see is for hypogamous marriage, when wife has more education than the husband, this is almost like a little, almost not so much of the penalty, it's a little, right? But look at the spouse is also very little increase in terms of marriage premium. Right? So this is sort of the differences by different types of sort of mating. But when we see 2 or more children, then we're seeing homogamous marriage men really took off in terms of their earning trajectory. Having 2 or more children, there's a lot big larger increase in earnings, and also for hypergamous marriage, husband's earning also increased quite a bit. And then for hypogamous marriage, when the husband has no college education, it is still kind of a smaller increase in terms of marriage premium. And then for the penalty side, and for the wife, then you see here again, there's an impact. But, finally, we're seeing this sort of a significant marriage penalty for women in hypogamous marriage. And this is much sharper here. So this is again telling us, I think for this particular group, hypogamous marriage, there's a less penalty and also less premium for the wife and the husband in that type of relationship. But the sort of a relationship penalty is strongest, for this group in hypogamous marriage, but the gain will be the largest for homogamous marriage for the husband, right? So this type of pattern we can also see, across racial groups. So being a white, it seems like there's more marriage premium for one child or 2 children when they are white, and for Black, and then also you see gains in marriage premium. But at the same time, we just see, women, African American women with 1 child, instead of penalty, there's a gain in type of relationship. So actually, African American women could work more in that type of relationship. So this is sort of gives us a sense of who is more likely to provide marriage premium and how that affects, the penalty when you also think about, racial group differences. So its limitations, I think, data that we are working with is a single cohort, right? We're not really looking at the more recent data. So it was really the emergence of the time, there's a more hypogamous marriage, but, it is 79 data. And also we only look at first marriages and up to 10 years, so that's could also be potential bias there. But I think the most critical thing is that we talk about division of labor, but we can only look at earnings in the labor market, but we don't really have much information in terms of time use, in terms of division of labor at home, right? And also we are not able to, differentiate whether that it's really coming from specialization at work or really workplace discrimination that is sort of a changing in changes in earning differences. But regardless, I think we have these findings in the college-educated women and men in homogamous marriage are the most advantaged in family background. They started with strong backgrounds, but even interactions with, having children, fatherhood premium is highest for homogamous marriage, and their spouses have strong motherhood penalty. So this is sort of the thing, and also fatherhood premium is, particularly strong for couples in homogamous marriage, and the motherhood penalty is particularly large for couples in hypergamous marriage. So, and when we back to hypogamous marriage, we do see there's a least fatherhood premium and also least the motherhood penalty for women. So we don't know for sure is how household specialization and work discrimination plays a role, but at least it is the issues. I think we sum them up. We're adding this particular group, their men's earning and the women's earnings, they sum them up is much lower than the earning total for the other groups. So which also means whether, it could be, with the hypogamous marriages, women have to work extra harder, would have to make a tough choice, hard choice, whether they want to spend more time at home or whether they want to invest in work and how much their, spouses can help, right, in pushing, contributing to both, hours at home and also in the workplace. So, happy to take questions.